Welcome back to the Zoo and Goo podcast. This is NBA Storytime, Episode 2, Running Gun Suns.
Oh, shizzle.
The Phoenix Suns from the 2004-05 NBA season to the 2007-08 season played a brand of basketball that can only be described as fast-paced and high-volume three-point shooting. Their fast-paced offense was named the 7 seconds or less offense, and these Suns teams are known as the Run and Gun Suns. Led by head coach Mike D'Antoni, star point guard Steve Nash, and star center Amar'e Stoudemire, the Phoenix Suns were able to revolutionize the way basketball is played and pave the way for future teams like the Dynasty Warriors and the James Harden Rockets. Let's start with some background information on the forming of the roster. We'll start with their leader, Steve Nash. Nash would be the leader of this fast-paced offense. Nash actually started his career with the Suns in '96 after being drafted 15th overall. He played for a few years and then in '99 was traded to Dallas in exchange for 2 role players and a first-round pick. That first-round pick would later become Shawn Marion. Marion would become a valuable shooter on these run-and-gun teams. Anyways, back to Nash. Nash played in Dallas for 6 seasons alongside Dirk Nowitzki, and he had 2 All-Star appearances. He then signed in Phoenix before the 04-05 season. In the 02 draft, the Suns drafted center Amar'e Stoudemire with the 9th pick. He would win Rookie of the Year in the 02-03 season, and Stoudemire would be a huge part of the Suns roster for years to come. So that's how they got Nash, Stoudemire, and Shawn Marion. The other pieces of the roster would change ever so slightly, but the lineup was centered around Stoudemire, Nash, and Shawn Marion. So we're going to get into the year-by-year breakdown. Do you have any thoughts before we do that?
No. Obviously, I was born in 2003. Wasn't really, aware of basketball, so I'm excited to get into it.
All right, here we go. 2004-2005 NBA season. In the offseason, the Suns, like I said earlier, signed Steve Nash, and they also signed a role player, Quentin Richardson. Richardson would be a valued three-point shooter and an important part of the offense in the upcoming season. The main lineup for the Suns season would be Steve Nash, Joe Johnson, Shawn Marion, Quentin Richardson, and Amar'e Stoudemire. So they played a 4-out, 1-in type of offense. That's the main offense that D'Antoni really runs. This lineup was bolstered by a bench with Jim Jackson and Leandro Barbosa. Going into the season, the Suns were a slept-on team. The contenders before the season were the Dwayne Wade and Shaq-led Heat. Believe it or not, the Garnett Timberwolves were pretty hyped up. The Pistons were just coming off a championship over the Lakers, so they were a contender as well. The Kings still had Chris Webber. The Spurs had Tim Duncan, and even the Pacers with Reggie Miller were kind of hyped up. The Suns surprised a lot of people by winning 62 games and being the first seed out west. They had the best offense in the league, but because of the pace they played at, they had the worst defense. Their pace was first in the league by a lot. Now, it's interesting to note that the pace they played at would be second to last in today's NBA. So they would be second to last, only ahead of the Mavericks. It was very interesting to think about the different way basketball was played. The Suns had all-star appearances by Nash, Marion, and Stoudemire. With Nash winning the MVP, Mike D'Antoni was Coach of the Year. The Suns would sweep the Grizzlies in the first round. Steve Nash had a nice revenge series against the Mavericks in the second round, and in the conference finals, they matched up against the Spurs. The Dynasty Spurs would beat the Suns in 5 close games. This series was very close. Each game was very good. Stoudemire had 37 points per game and just under 10 boards, including 2 40-point games. However, Tim Duncan matched Stoudemire by averaging 27 and 14. The trio of Duncan, Ginobili, and Parker would put up at least 20 a game. This series was a very good and close series. One of the lowlights for the Suns was Shawn Marion. This was earlier in his career, and he only shot 1 for 7 from 3 the entire series. It's very interesting that a three-point shooter who shot 33% on 4 attempts per game in the regular season only shot 7 threes in 5 games. Outside of Nash, Stoudemire, and Jim Jackson, who played phenomenally well in the series, the Suns really didn't have much help. Joe Johnson was lackluster in the series, and the main separator between the two teams was depth, and this is a common theme throughout the rest of the story, is that they just didn't have a lot of depth. The Spurs had a lot more depth than the Suns, and that's really what put them ahead. thoughts?
No, not really. Pretty interesting. I'm just listening right now.
All right, so we'll get into the 2005-2006 NBA season. The Suns didn't do too much to their roster going into this season. They lost Joe Johnson to the Hawks in the offseason, but that wasn't too big of a blow because Johnson didn't really fit their brand of basketball. He was more of an ISO player, and they didn't want that. They drafted Nate Robinson and Marcin Gortat. Neither of them would have huge impacts, but it's interesting to note that both those players would prove to be very good in the NBA. This Suns season was plagued by an injury to Amari Stoudemire. He only played 3 games in the regular season and none in the playoffs. To replace him, they looked to second-year player Boris Diaw. Diaw would play a huge role and won the Most Improved Player award. Sean Marion also stepped up, providing huge scoring and rebounding in Stoudemire's absence. Nash would win MVP again, and him and Marion would be all-stars. The role players outside of Diaw that stepped up would be James Jones, Eddie House, and Rajah Bell. These role players would combine for about 40 points per game and were really valuable. Rajah Bell was the best three-point shooter on the team, shooting 44% from 3. Once again, they had the best offense, but a bottom defense in the league. They were the best three-point shooting team, and they won 54 games and ended up being a 2 seed in the West. Before we go into the postseason, I want to point out that this may have actually been the best Suns team. If Stoudemire had played, then they probably would have won. They probably would have at least made the finals this year. They were very good. This was a wild postseason for the Suns. In the first round, they went down 3-1 to the Kobe Lakers. Literally just Kobe was on that team. They had Kwame Brown. That's about it. In a crazy series, they would come back and win in 7. This was one of the best playoff series of the 2000s. We had Kobe's game winner in Game 4 to put the Lakers up 3-1.
To go off the clock by not being close to a man.
They'd love to get it into Nash's hands, and they do.
Ball knocked away, stolen by Parker.
There it is.
Here comes George to Kobe Bryant. Bryant inside. It's good. It's good. Tie game.
That was a huge moment in Kobe's career. But the Suns would storm back with convincing wins in Game 5, 6, and 7. The Suns followed this series up with another 7-game series against the Clippers. So this series was back and forth, and the Suns would win Game 7 by 20. That series had its fair share of moments, including a Game 3 sealing shot with 3 seconds to go by Steve Nash. They would run into the Mavericks in the conference finals and lose in 6. This series was very good. The Suns looked like they had a chance at winning the series. They won Game 1 due to a go-ahead jumper in the final seconds by Boris Diaw. Diaw also dropped 34 in the victory. So we're looking at Diaw stepping up in Stoudemire's absence. Going into a pivotal Game 5, it was tied 2-2, but Dirk dropped 50 points at home, and Dallas took back the series lead. Game 6 was a good game, but the Suns ran out of gas, as they only went 7 deep for the game, so once again, they really do not have any depth. Jerry Stackhouse helped the Mavericks from the bench, and once again, we're looking at who has the better bench, and the Mavericks had a better bench. Jerry Stackhouse, 6-man, pulls up and drops 19. Dirk had 24. It was just too much for the Suns to handle, and it was really, the Suns also ran out of steam. They just played 2 highly intense 7-game series, and you really have nothing left for the conference finals after that. The Mavericks would play the Heat in the finals, and they would lose.
Yeah.
Because Dwayne Wade kind of went sicko mode in that series. So let's get into 2006-07 NBA season. The Suns didn't really do too much in the offseason. They figured that with Stoudemire returning, they would be just fine. They drafted Rajon Rondo, 21st overall, but they traded him immediately to Boston. The Suns had the best offense, and for the first time were actually top half of the league in defensive rating. The Suns were 3rd in pace and won 61 games. The Suns were the 2 seed that year. Nash, Marion, and Stoudemire were all All-Stars. And the Suns beat the Lakers in the first round in 5 games. Big contributions from Leandro Barbosa put the Suns ahead in the series. Kobe dropped 33 a game, but it really wasn't enough because Lamar Odom was his second best player, and they were never going to put up much of a fight. Kobe had to drop 45 a game, or he had to drop 45 in Game 3 to get the Lakers' only victory of the series. They would then run into the Spurs in the second round. The first 4 games of the series were back and forth, with it being tied 2-2. However, in the final minutes of Game 4, Spurs forward Robert Horry would absolutely body check Steve Nash, and we actually just watched this before filming this.
Yeah, that was
it was something. After the hard foul, Amari Stoudemire and Boris Diaw got up off the bench, and the NBA fight broke out. It really wasn't much. It was just a bunch of talking, sort of like how it is, all of those little brawls are hold me back type of stuff. Anyway, Diaw and Stoudemire were suspended for 1 game, and Robert Horry was suspended for 2 games. But if you think about it, the Spurs, while Robert Horry was very good, the Spurs didn't need Robert Horry. But the Suns needed Stoudemire and Diaw. In Game 5, the Spurs would win in a low-scoring slugfest. They would only win by 3. The Suns went only 6 deep for that game, so they really missed Stoudemire and Diaw. Game 6 was an 8-point win by the Spurs. In Stoudemire's return, he dropped 38 points. Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, and Tim Duncan, however, combined for 87 of the Spurs' 114 points in the Game 6 win. It's interesting to note here that Stoudemire averaged 37 a game in the series against the Spurs 2 years prior. Then he would average 26 in this series. So the Spurs defense was really never able to slow him down, but it was the fact that the Suns did not have a bench, so they could not compete with the Spurs. This season started the rumblings about whether or not D'Antoni can actually win in the playoffs with the style of play that he coaches, because he's all offense, no defense. 2007-2008 NBA season. This was the last season of the run and gun team. Sean Marion was tired of hearing his name in trade talks during the offseason, and GM Steve Kerr was shopping him around. So Marion was like, screw you, I'm going to request a trade. And they would actually find a trade mid-season. They sent Sean Marion and Marcus Banks to the Heat for Shaquille O'Neal. This trade was a poor decision for the Suns, but they felt like they had to do it because Marion requested a trade, and they weren't going to be able to extend him in the offseason. Shaq made the Suns very slow, but they were definitely better in the half court. So Steve Kerr's idea behind this was he wanted to match up better against the Spurs by adding another big man. The Suns would win 55 games and were a 6th seed, and they got matched up against the Spurs again in the playoffs. Now, this time it was in the first round. They lost Game 1 by 2 after Ginobili hit the go-ahead layup with 2 seconds left.
But they're not going to use it. Ginobili to the basket, puts it up, banks it in with 1.8 remaining.
Duncan had 40 in that game, so Shaq and Stoudemire are not stopping Tim Duncan. Game 2 was another Spurs victory. Game 3, the Spurs won again. Now they're up 3-0. Nobody has ever come back down 3-0, and this wasn't going to be any different as the Suns would lose in 5. Stoudemire dropped 23-9 for the series. Nash had 16-8. Shaq was very lackluster and not his prime Shaq. It was realized that the Suns should have just given Marion an extension at the beginning of the year and really never shopped him around in trade talks. After that season, the rebuild would start. The Suns would fire Mike D'Antoni, and they actually ran it back with a similar team the next season, but with an injury to Stoudemire, they would miss the playoffs. The team would dismantle, and it would take a while for the Suns to reach the playoffs again, with only really being real contenders again in recent years. Stoudemire would get traded to the Knicks, Shaq was sent to the Cavs, and Nash would get traded to the Lakers in 2012. Stoudemire was the primary scorer for the squad during these years. He was a very good co-star for Steve Nash, and he would average 24-9 per game during those 4 years. He was an all-star for the 3 years that he was healthy for. I want to say one final word regarding Steve Nash. He consistently averaged 18 and 11, so 18 points and 11 assists during this 4-year prime. He was an all-star each year, and he won 2 MVPs. And you're seeing maybe if Steve Nash played in today's NBA, do you think he would be more like Steph Curry or Trae Young?
No. He would be, I don't even know what to compare him to. He'd be a solid point guard. I don't think he'd be like an MVP candidate, especially with those numbers. Obviously, the numbers would be inflated. He'd probably have 24
Well, so that's what I'm
25.
saying with today's NBA, he would probably shoot a lot more threes. Like he was a
Yeah.
very good 3-point shooter, but his main role in the offense was to set it up. So I'm wondering if you put him in today's NBA, would he be like a really good 3-point shooter and something like Steph Curry? Obviously, he wouldn't be Steph Curry because Steph Curry is wild, but he might be something.
Like Chris Paul.
Yeah,
I like Chris Paul
probably.
with a better jumper.
Yeah, definitely. So, do you have any thoughts here?
Obviously the Spurs were a big reason for the Suns not really doing much in the playoffs, other than getting to the conference finals. But also, when I listen, I just hear like when you say Boris Dia, I think of the Spurs, because that's what I remember watching him on when he was on the Spurs. And then when I think of James Jones, I think of the Suns, like not the player, but like the general manager.
Yeah, it's interesting to see, like, when we do these older teams, we're gonna not be thinking about them on the Suns. We're gonna be thinking about them. What did they do when we actually watched
Yeah,
basketball?
like what are they doing right now? Like Stoudemire, wasn't he like in like an African league, and now he's a coach on the Nets?
Yeah, his last season actually was overseas. I actually have his stats up right here. His last season he played in Israel.
Yeah,
the
Israel.
Pro
Yeah,
League.
I remember that. Yeah, so it's just crazy to see this. I think this team, if they played right now, they would. Although their pace would be second to last according to like the stats, I think they'd probably do pretty well in the NBA now, like rather than back then.
Yeah, they probably would have upped the pace if you think about it, because
Yeah.
that was revolutionary pace for back then.
Yeah, I know.
So they probably would have kept it going. And D'Antoni, I mean, so you're looking at D'Antoni tried. I don't think he learned the right lessons from the Suns teams that he coached going forward to the Rockets.
Yeah.
Like, he took his 3-point shooting. He decided to go 5 out and nobody in as offense.
Scored a lot of points.
And you can put up a bunch of points, but the issue was always defense with these teams. They had 1 year where they were top half in the league in defense. So if you can't play defense, then how are you supposed to win a championship?
Yeah, just like we saw this year, the top 2 defensive rated teams were in the championship. So
Exactly.
it's more about defense, but I think that this team, although it's seen as like a massive failure, I don't know. I think they had a pretty solid team, and I think Stoudemire's injuries, if he'd stayed healthy during that one season where he missed every game except for 3, I think they probably could have won the championship that year, especially because they got to the Western Conference Finals without him. So with him, I don't know. I think they'd have a pretty good shot at it.
Yeah, and especially if you think about it, because the Mavericks, they really had Dirk and who else?
I don't even know.
Exactly. So, I mean,
Stackhouse.
I'm sure they had other players, but the point that we're trying to make here is you didn't have 2 stars. You probably had just Dirk and a bunch of role players, which is good. But if Nash gets Stoudemire, first off, Nash plays better, and you know Stoudemire is going to drop like 24 a game, and
At least.
that's going to help. So that was probably their best chance at winning, and they never won a ring. They didn't even make it to the finals. It's really disappointing, but at least they paved the way for,
Future NBA.
yeah.
Well, like last week we talked about the Clippers and how they probably would have been better in like the early 2000s. I think this team would be better now. Like if they flip flop.
Yeah, it's-
Although, you talked about like how their reign is like 2 years before the Clippers start.
It's 3 or 4, but
yeah.
it's
Flip-flop 'em,
interesting
they-
how the league changed so quickly.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're trying to say.
It is, and it's still changing today. So it's kind of nuts.
Well, that is all we have for today's podcast. We'll see you next time.
Peace.